Good afternoon, all. It's Mr. Fain here with another content review. I'm wearing the greatness of the Radiohead t shirt from many, many years ago, but not playing Radiohead music. Instead, I have my soul playlist going because I don't like silence. Start the presentation here. Today's little content review is about the first unit in the modern era called revolutions. So some of it's going to be pretty obvious that it's about political revolutions. But then there's also a big chunk about industrial or technological revolutions. And that's 1750 to 1900. Okay. So what you see on the screen, you don't just see revolutions themselves, you see all the kind of causes and effects. You notice there's a lot of arrows about migration, like Irish to America, Indians to South Africa, China to the US. Those migrations are actually covered in Unit 6, which is next week, I guess when you're watching it, the week after. And that's called Consequences of Industrialization, because industrialization is one of these revolutions. So looking at, like we always do, the Albert test to see what we're going to focus on, meaning what you didn't do well on, nationalism and revolutions, and then the government's role in industrialization. Those stuck out like a decrepit, needing to be decapitated thumb on this test. Pretty bad. So to put everything in perspective, let me put myself in the middle for a minute because we're going to talk about the ends of this kind of chart. And I can share this with you guys later as kind of a one-page review of both Unit 6 and Unit 5 and 6. We're going to start talking about the right of this chart first, with the two kind of political trends of the era, nationalism and the revolutions that are spawned. Everything here is kind of organized into either ideas or actions, because some of the things that this unit has more important than others is how ideas can spur actions. So the Enlightenment was a philosophical movement starting in the 1600s in Europe. There's an American component called the Age of Reason. It's the same thing because the Americans at this time were a European colony. These Enlightenment ideas call for a new relationship between man and the world around him. It's a continuation of what started in the Renaissance. It's a continuation of what started in the scientific revolution, where old traditions were called into question, old learning. So the Enlightenment is that man can figure out the world around him, and therefore all kinds of relationships are questioned. Man's relationship to the natural world, man's relationship to traditional ideas, and the role of science continues to increase. So in the political realm, Enlightenment ideals call about the nature of the rights of man, natural rights, what's called social contract theory, how the government governs because of the consent of the governed, not because of divine right. So then actions that come off of this include all these revolutions. You notice they're in four general categories. Latin American is broken up into Mexico, those in South America, and then Brazil separately from the South American ones. But these Enlightenment ideas also trigger after these revolutions either social movements like the abolitionist movement to end slavery, feminism, the right to have equal rights for women, which continues on into the 20th century, obviously, and then Darwinism as an idea of looking at human life differently in its origins. Politically, two major political forms will come about in these revolutions. Conservative principles that look to avoid change for the sake of change and sometimes focus more on tradition and what's always been done and the traditional groups that are in power, or liberalism in the 19th century sense, not the way the word is used today. Liberalism is seeking, I guess, to establish progress in the realms of representative government and free trade. So the opposite of liberalism would be economically, it would be mercantilism, where the state restricts trade. Okay, so liberalism and capitalism in the 19th century are kind of synonyms. So this side of the chart is happening at the same time as this side of the Industrial Revolution. Industrialism starts in Britain. Enlightenment itself doesn't start in Britain, but Britain's a big component of it. Okay? So we'll come back to this chart probably later in this. Put myself in the ocean here. So based on the Albert diagnostic, you guys had issues with the relationship between nationalism and revolution. Okay? So this page represents the colonial revolutions that you're going to see on the left-hand side. All those dates are the dates of independence in the American Revolution, Haitian Revolution, and Latin American revolutions. You'll see the French Revolution up top as well. Okay, we'll talk about these two things in just a second. So in terms of revolutions, the most important to recognize, the American is the first. I have a chart in the next page that kind of compares some of these elements. And then the French is next. And I put two images about the French Revolution here. Napoleon, even though he's going to become a dictator and an emperor, he rises in the revolution because of his talents and his merits, not because of his blood or his birth. He's the example of the Enlightenment man, who because of skill and learning rises to the top of the French society, takes that power to his head, though, and creates an empire and tries to conquer the world. And the other figure you see here, the red, white, and blue, that becomes the French tricolor flag. And this is a member of the common lower class urban society called the sans culottes. Literally means those without knee breeches, and knee breeches were kind of these short pants that you don't see here, because these working men wore long pants to protect their legs when they worked. So these are lower class urban workers who at the beginnings of the French Revolution were the most radical. They went into monarchy. They'll have to force the execution of the king, and they'll force a crazy period in the French Revolution called the Reign of Terror, where everything from the past is going to be tried to be changed. From government to religion, it's pretty radical and crazy for a year. Then with the Haitian Revolution, this is Toussaint Louverture. He's a former slave who leads the island to independence. And so the Haitian Revolution is obviously about race and slavery. Okay. In the Latin American revolutions, you kind of have to divide up. This is the most famous Latin American revolutionary, Simón Bolívar. At one point, he was the president of an association of Latin American states, the United States of Gran Colombia. It eventually breaks apart in the nations we have today, but he is called the Great Liberator. And he is kind of the George Washington of South America. But that's of Spanish South America. All these dates that I'm kind of pointing at, these are the modern Spanish-speaking states. The Brazilian Revolution is a little bit different. And we'll talk more about that specifically on the next slide too. The Brazilian Revolution, it just takes the monarch from Portugal, because Brazil was a Portuguese territory, and that monarchy moves from Europe and implants itself on top of Brazil. So Brazil will have a king until 1889. So it's kind of different from the rest of these revolutions that are more constitutional and representative. The Brazilian Revolution, one of the later ones, also establishes a monarchy. Okay. Nationalism, in another sense, while these revolutions are more about colonies breaking away from a mother country, there'll be ideas, especially like in the French Revolution, of what does it mean to be a French citizen. And the idea of French nationality is a rallying point to bind a country together. You'll have all these various German states joined together in 1871 to become a Germany in reaction to that idea of, well, if there's the French, then there needs to be a place for the German. And you get the same thing for the Italian. So what nationalism causes problems for are these multi-ethnic empires that aren't held together by this idea of an ethnic group. were held together by different ideas. So one of those multi-ethnic empires in this era, the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire is run by Turks, but it encompasses Arabs up in the Balkans, Slavs, Greeks, even in Asia Minor itself, there are Armenians. So it has to have a different idea of what does it mean to be a member of the Ottoman Empire, and it struggles with this idea of nationalism. And it declines in the 1750 to 1900 period. And eventually, it just dissolves into a Turkish nation, a nation for Turks. So to compare all these revolutions, myself over here for now, I have the four that you guys had the most problems, really the three had the most problems with on the test. Americans up here because you should know it from 8th grade, and this is a good comparison so you can see what's similar. I want you to remember kind of the timeline of these, important people in each, important documents, because if this is an Enlightenment revolution, that means they want to establish their principles in writing, because the writing would look past you. You're not loyal to a person, you're loyal to an idea in writing. And then two types of causes, political and then socioeconomic, and what are the larger impacts. So the American quickly, 1775 to 1783, it's the Treaty of Paris ending the war. 1789 is when the Constitution is ratified by enough states to make it the law of the land. Jefferson the idealist, Washington the leader. Okay. Jefferson is the author of the Declaration of Independence that establishes those rights, those natural rights argument for why we shouldn't be a colony. And the Constitution sets up that representative government with checks and balances. So why was it caused? 8th grade review. The colonists didn't have representation in Parliament or the lawmaking body, so no representation. But primary causes to me are more economic. The colonies were under mercantilism. You'll see this trend apply to all three of these revolutions to come, or at least the colonial ones. Trade was for the benefit of the mother country. So the colonists, the producers of the goods, weren't allowed to make the most they could from them because they were under the reign of the British monarch. Cap that off as they were also taxed higher to pay for British war debts. So they saw their economic or their pocketbook, their wallet hurting. So the primary leaders of the early revolution were Southern plantation owners whose cotton was exports, or New England merchants who had manufactured goods and or shipped these goods. Okay. Impacts, it's hard to see because of my bar that won't go away, so I'll just read it to you. The impacts were it's the first successful colonial revolution, throwing off transoceanic empires from Unit 4. And it's the first modern constitutional government. Okay, so they don't establish a monarchy, they establish a constitutional structure. Which then leads us to the French. Notice the timeline here, how close they are. The French were the American ally, the French was a monarchy. But many of these soldiers that came back from helping to establish an American representative structure call into question some of what's happening in France. Important things to know, there's this kind of feudal institution called the Estates General, with three broad estates or groups in France are called together to do the king's bidding, to give him money. First estate is the church, second estate is the nobility, the third estate is everybody else. So that everybody else will kind of push this revolution forward, because when we look at causes later, it's the fact that the third estate had no political rights. The third estate is taxed. The third estate is still under social restrictions based on feudalism. Okay? The most radical group from the previous page of this third estate are the sans-culottes. They're the urban worker, the one that is most likely to be harmed by economic ups and downs. When the price of food goes high, the sans-culottes feel it because they're the urban poor. But they're also grouped together in larger numbers in urban areas. So the Enlightenment ideas can spread amongst them. And they can also, power of numbers, use those ideas and the violence that comes with it to get their way. The National Assembly is the Congress, so to speak, of the first era of the French Revolution after they get rid of the monarch, or after they take the monarch out of power. He's not dead yet. Robespierre is the leader of the most radical group in the National Assembly called the Mountain. And the Mountain gains power through something called the Committee of Public Safety to secure the revolution against its enemies. And they commit what's called the Reign of Terror, where they will guillotine, imprison, destroy any opponents of the revolution. They even go so as far as to think that the only way the revolution will succeed is if they wipe out all vestiges of the old. So that means the Catholic Church has got to go. That means the nobility's got to go. If I got to go, it means kill them. Okay? So the revolution gets pretty crazy in 1790 and 91. That's when the Reign of Terror and Robespierre are in charge. They had already established through something called the Declaration of Rights of Man their basic Bill of Rights that abolished feudalism, that establishes rights of citizenship for men. But then they try to go further. Napoleon Bonaparte was a general in the French armies because the French try to export their revolution. And so he comes to power when they're fighting basically all of Europe. And he's kind of seen as someone who tames the French Revolution from its radical stages to something more conservative until it becomes a monarchy again when he makes himself emperor. So if you take AP Euro, I used to spend 6 weeks on the French Revolution. Okay? So the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, think of that as like the French Bill of Rights that's in the American Constitution. Cause of it, end absolutism. The third estate wants rights. The third estate doesn't want to be taxed fully. They want all classes to be taxed. And they want all vestiges of feudalism to go. Now, the French Revolution doesn't start these ideas of representative government or natural rights for citizens. The American Revolution does that. But the French Revolution is more consequential because it spreads those ideas through Europe through war. And then consequently through the Spanish and Portuguese colonies that the French will take over, including the French colonies as well. So the spread of representative ideas or revolutionary ideas, that is a result of the French Revolution. So the French Revolution really has more of an immediate global impact, even though the American is first. So the Haitian Revolution, notice chronology, American influences French, French influences Haitian. Haiti was Saint Dominique, a French sugar colony, 40% of the world's sugar from there, which meant it was a gigantic slave society. There were white people, two groups, the little whites, the big whites. They were about 40,000 people. Slave population was 500,000. And then there were freed peoples of color, which is about 30,000. So there's a big racial component to the Haitian Revolution that we don't see in these other two. So the causes of these revolutions are going to be a little different. Okay? Since the French Revolution is happening, and the National Assembly puts out things like the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which specifically ends serfdom, and later the National Assembly will outlaw slavery. In the colonies, people of color, whether they're free or slave, Toussaint Louverture was a slave who resists slavery and becomes a leader, they want to call for an abolishment of slavery. The whites don't want slavery gone because that's the economic livelihood of the island. So you have an Enlightenment idea of natural rights coming from France. They all want rights. The colonists want an end to French government. So they want political rights, especially the rich whites, the Grand Blancs. The people of color want to be free and be citizens. Okay, so the different causes. Political looks like the American Revolution. Political representation, don't want to be a colony. But the social and economic elements are different. For the whites, it's not. It's they want to end mercantilism just like the American Revolution did. They don't want to have to pay taxes to France. But for the lower class whites, for the free blacks, and for the slaves, it's about having the rights of citizenship to be equal to the rich. The importance of the Haitian Revolution is it's the first former slave state to become a republic, the only slave republic in the New World. It's going to freak out slave owning societies throughout the Western Hemisphere. Haiti, from its start, is kind of isolated. The United States won't trade with it because they fear the infection of abolition moving to the southern states in the United States. Okay? That is a consequence. That's why it's the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. Because from the start, it has to fend for itself. Okay? So the Brazilian Revolution, it's one of the Latin American, as I said earlier. It's different because it's not going to try to impose many of these kind of political causes about representative government and an end to monarchy. Instead, it's going to want to reject the idea of constitutions, and it wants to keep monarchy. Now, why do I have Napoleon in Brazil? Napoleon is going to invade the Iberian Peninsula, and he's going to take over Spain. He's going to try to invade Portugal, but it doesn't work. But the Portuguese monarchy, because they didn't want to become captured by the French if they were successful, the whole French monarchy moves to Brazil. Okay? And when it's time to come back, when Napoleon is defeated, and I should have talked about this day here earlier, 1799 is when I say the French Revolution ends, because that's when Napoleon becomes emperor. Napoleon is defeated the second and final time in 1814, and then the French government goes back to being an absolute monarchy. Okay? Well, while Napoleon in this 1799 to 1814 period is invading Europe, Pedro I of Portugal takes the monarchy to Brazil. When Napoleon is kicked off the throne of France in 1814, and the citizens of Portugal want to invite the monarch back from Brazil, they don't want to invite him back to be an old kind of absolute monarch. They want him to be a constitutional government. He can be the monarch, but he has to agree to written rules and a larger role for a Portuguese parliament, for lack of a better word. Pedro doesn't want to go back to Portugal and be under the thumb of a legislature. He wants to reject this idea of constitutional government. So he just says, to hell with you, Portugal. I'll just be the emperor of Brazil. Okay? So the Brazilian revolution, so to speak, is just revolting against what these other things are doing. It rejects representative government. It wants to continue slavery. Okay? Slavery continues until 1888 in Brazil, which was the major slave-holding nation to begin with. Okay? Now, they do want to end mercantilism because they don't want to pay Portugal, but they'll be their own government, their own empire. So it's a conservative revolution led by a Portuguese monarch to just become the emperor of Brazil. Now, notice under important documents for each of these, there's not specific Haitian one. There's a Haitian constitution. There's like three. There's a Haitian Declaration of Independence. But the one that matters for the colonial revolution, that's not the Americas, is something called the Jamaica Letter by our buddy Simon Bolivar, where he lays out the idea of free republics in South America. So these are all those revolutions. Let's comparative thing there. Next kind of revolution is the Industrial Revolution. Notice I have a big S. There are more than one. There's the first one, which is the one mostly studied. It's about the energy source is steam from water. And it's the mechanization of production and transportation. Okay? So this is the first Industrial Revolution. The second Industrial Revolution is when that focuses more on the factory system and division of labor, where steam was the energy source of the first, electricity is the second. Okay? And then just so for your information, the third is kind of the IT revolution. And some say we're probably living in a fourth revolution, which would be AI. Okay? So you might get questions on the second difference from the first. This is steam engine, mechanical production, things like textiles, and clothing. With electricity, division of labor, and mass production, this is automobiles, that thing like that. Okay? So you had the last topic of the day, and the thing you guys had the most problem was, is okay, if these revolutions are happening in industry, what is the government doing? What's the government role? So on this slide, you have different viewpoints here. You've got the idea that a government's role is to help modernize. So in Belgium, continental Europe, Prussia, until it becomes a Germany, the government is supposed to sponsor industrialization. You see the same thing happening later in Russia, because the Russian government, the Russian Tsar, is going to try to do what most industrializing countries want to do, a modern industrial transportation system, meaning a railroad. They'll create the Trans-Siberian Railroad to connect the Siberian or Pacific Russia to the European Russia. And to have a railroad, you have to have steel, you have to have coal. Those are all part and parcel of what a industrial revolution is going to do. In areas that aren't European or Western, you'll have attempts by states to sponsor improvements. So in China, you have what's called the self-strengthening movement, where merchants or trade, the government will try to sponsor it to make them strong enough to withstand Western imperialism, but it doesn't really work well. And there'll be a revolutionary rebellion called the Taiping Rebellion. In Egypt, you'll have an Ottoman governor, Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, but Muhammad Ali, who will try to modernize the Egyptian textile industry, because Egypt's a major source of cotton. By doing that, he wants to kind of industrialize on the British model Egypt. It'll fail because they'll go into debt with loans they take to try to do this, in debt to European powers. And then we're going to talk more specifically about what happens in the Ottoman Empire and what happens in Japan. And that's what the next two slides are. So in the Ottoman Empire, remember I told you already, they were a multi-ethnic state that was having problems in this nationalist era of getting its various ethnic groups to identify as what does it mean to be Ottoman. So what these Tanzimat reforms are, beginning in 1839 and ending in 1876, are attempting to make the Ottoman monarchy a modern constitutional state by instituting kind of modern representative rights-based governmental ideas. So in this Tanzimat propaganda, this woman flying, she's carrying a banner that has the motto of the French Revolution on it: liberty, equality, fraternity, to try to show that we're bringing into the modern era the idea of French ideas of representative government, breaking the chains of a woman to show kind of feminism, and then all these different ethnic groups showing that they're all behind the Ottomans. Tanzimat reforms won't work because the Ottoman Empire itself is declining, and the conservative faction will end Tanzimat reforms in the 1870s. The Meiji Restoration, though, in Japan is successful. Three images here. This is the Japanese rising sun flag. You notice these Japanese look very modern as opposed to the samurai. So it's modernization of the tradition. Steamships and industry. So the Meiji Restoration in 1860 attempts to end the shogunate, create a modern society with a modern army. Emperor is going to be the focal point for that. It's about Japan and not about clans. And then they're going to create their own empire. So Meiji Restoration, successful modernization, Tanzimat not. Okay. So when we get to Unit 6, we'll look at some of these other things, the consequences of the Industrial Revolution, including migration. But I am done for now.